You weren't a soldier, just a lonely old man with stories. That's what the waitress muttered as she whisked past Harold Dent's table, clearing plates he hadn't touched and barely concealing her eye roll behind a tight-lipped smirk. She didn't see the man, only the chair. Didn't care about the way he sat with his back perfectly straight, hands folded neatly over a cloth napkin, the tips of his polished brown shoes aligned like formation boots, even though his legs hadn't held him in over 30 years. No one in that cafe knew his name when he rolled in, let alone what kind of silence he carried. A silence shaped by jungles that reeked of sweat and cordite, and decisions made too quickly with lives on the line. That day, he'd worn his usual attire: clean slacks, crisp button-down shirt, navy blue blazer with a brass Marine Corps pin just above the lapel, but no one saw that either. Not really. Not the teenage hostess who told him they had no seating for wheels today. Not the manager who shrugged from behind the espresso machine and said, "We're kinda slammed, sir. You know how it is." And especially not the college kid in cargo shorts who leaned over and said loudly, "Man, this guy think he's in a war movie or something?" And Harold, he didn't reply. He never did. Instead, he wheeled himself to the one free corner table they hadn't bothered to clear, sat silently, and stared at his coffee while laughter rolled in waves from the barista station. And right now, before we go any further, if you believe that honor doesn't expire just because a man sits quietly in the back, go ahead and like and subscribe, because what happens next deserves to be remembered. The clatter of dishes and low hum of shallow conversations masked the real story brewing in that corner booth. Because behind Harold's chair, wrapped in the thick leather of a faded messenger bag, was a sealed shadow box. Polished glass, dark walnut frame, velvet backing. The kind you don't open unless you're ready to reckon with everything inside. It hadn't been touched since 1972. Not once. Inside were medals, half of them unrecognizable to anyone under 50. A silver star with battle tarnish, 2 Navy crosses, a Vietnamese cross of gallantry with palm, a coin from a 4-star general, pressed between layers of faded velvet like a secret handshake left unfinished. And nestled into the lining of that box, just behind a letter folded in precise thirds, was a photograph of 12 Marines standing waist-deep in river mud. One of them still holding his rifle in the air, while another slung a wounded man across his back. Harold in the center, face unreadable, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. The waitress never saw that box. She never saw Harold's hands tremble slightly as he adjusted the strap on the back, or the way he checked the table's corners for threats he no longer expected but could never quite forget. Instead, she saw only the empty plate and said, "Still working on that. Or can I take it?" before grabbing it without waiting for a response. "Maybe next time, try somewhere with rants," another waiter muttered as he passed. No one knew who Harold was. Not the woman with a yoga mat slung over one shoulder who loudly asked if the vibe was getting weird. Not the couple at the window seat who giggled when the old man's phone rang with a tinny military march ringtone. And certainly not the kid near the back who pulled out his phone and whispered, "Gotta snap this. Grandpa's about to flash back." Snap. Flash. Laughter. But someone noticed. A young man at the bar, quiet, 20-something with an unshaven face and a tightly rolled army cap peeking from his back pocket, watched the scene unfold. He hadn't touched his coffee since Harold came in. Hadn't laughed. Hadn't moved. Just watched. Because he'd seen that pin on Harold's lapel before, on his father's casket, folded into the triangle of a burial flag. And he knew, not just who Harold might be, but what kind of weight he was carrying without saying a word. That's when the young man stood, pulled out his phone, and typed a single message. Code Redbird. Café Moselle. It's Dent. Then he stepped outside to wait. Inside, Harold remained still. He always did. He'd learned decades ago that the ones who made noise were rarely the ones you had to watch. And besides, he'd already done enough talking for one lifetime. On comms, in evacuation choppers, through morphine drips, and prayer. He'd earned his silence. But silence doesn't mean forgotten. Not today. Not when the text he never saw was already flying across time zones and satellites to inboxes marked confidential. And the men and women who saw that name, Dent, weren't the kind to shrug it off. Because once upon a time, he'd carried 6 Marines out of a burning firebase under live mortar fire. Once upon a time, he'd held the line so others could escape. And once upon a time, a general had told him, "If Dent calls, you go." But Harold never called. He never would. So someone else had to. The call went out quietly, without sirens or alarms. Just a few keystrokes and a name typed into a group chat marked Redbird Legacy. And within minutes, the ripple began. Not one of panic, but precision. The kind of quiet urgency that moves through channels others forget exist. 3 tables down, a man in a trench coat folded his newspaper and stepped outside, whispering into a cufflink mic. Across the street, a woman loading groceries into her car froze when her phone vibrated and read the name, Dent. She tapped the steering wheel once, then climbed into her SUV and made a call. Inside Café Moselle, Harold remained still, unaware of the chain reaction he'd triggered simply by existing in the wrong place with the wrong kind of dignity. The laughter still rolled, more subtle now, quieter, like the tide pulling back before the wave. A hostess refilled a glass and murmured to her coworker, "He hasn't even tipped." Figures. In the corner, the kid with the phone was editing his short video. Old vet can't take a hint. Hashtag respect the check. But at the door, the young man who had sent the message returned, this time not alone. A black SUV pulled up silently to the curb, its engine low, its windows tinted like a hearse that carried something heavier than death, memory. From the passenger side stepped a woman in dress blues. Lieutenant Colonel by the rank on her collar. Hair pulled into a razor-straight bun. She didn't glance at the chalkboard menu or the distressed wood decor. She walked in with boots that struck the tile floor like a metronome of reckoning. She approached Harold's table with a salute so sharp it made the air cut. And the cafe went quiet. The laughter stopped mid-breath. The fork paused halfway to a mouth. The barista dropped a cup. Harold looked up, confused at first, but she didn't wait. "Sir," she said, her voice clear, crisp, reverent. "We received your signal." "Didn't send one," he muttered, still clutching the handle of his coffee cup. "That's why we came," she replied. The young man at the door stepped forward. "I saw the pin. The bag. My dad trained under you. Said if I ever saw a man carrying silence like that, I'd know what to do." Harold didn't smile. But something in his eyes shifted. Recognition, maybe. Pain. Or just the weariness of being seen after so long in plain sight. Another SUV rolled up. Then another. One by one, men and women in uniform filed through the door. Navy whites. Army greens. Marine crimson. Some with canes. One missing a leg. Another with mirrored sunglasses and a dog tag swinging from his wrist, like a pendulum counting time between wars. They didn't come loudly. They didn't chant. They just filled the cafe with presence, the kind that doesn't beg for attention because it knows it owns the ground it walks on. Patrons shuffled in their seats. One woman whispered, "Is this a flash mob or something?" But the man beside her, a Gulf vet with sleeves hiding shrapnel scars, shook his head. "No, this is correction." The manager came out from the kitchen, stammering something about reservations and fire codes. Lieutenant Colonel Jameson, because that was her name, turned slowly. "We're not here for seats," she said. "We're here to stand for one." A pause, then louder. "This man held a fire base alone for 13 hours with 2 magazines and a radio battery that wouldn't die. This man pulled 3 of my instructors from a crash in Danang. This man taught half of us that silence isn't weakness, it's earned quiet. And this man will not be mocked over latte foam." The kid with the phone froze, lowered his camera, deleted the video. Harold finally spoke, not loud, just enough. "I didn't ask for this." "We know," Jameson said. "That's why it matters." Then, something strange happened. A man in a tailored business suit stood up and crossed the room. He looked 40, polished, Bluetooth still in one ear. "Mr. Dent," he asked softly. "Colonel Mendez. My father served under you in '68. Said you carried him after a misfire took his ankle. Said you said nothing the whole way, but you didn't drop him once." Harold blinked, once. Slowly, Mendez extended his hand. "I never knew how to thank you." A beat. Then Harold shook it. A simple grip. 2 old debts canceled without a receipt. Behind them, the staff stood frozen, awkward, ashamed, unsure of where to look. The waitress who had rolled her eyes earlier now clutched her notepad like a shield. One of the chefs peeked from the kitchen, whispering, "Is that the guy from the book?" Because somewhere, someone had read about the man who'd rerouted enemy forces using only field mirrors and sheer audacity. That man was Harold Dent, the one in the chair, the one they dismissed. Jameson leaned forward. "They're still coming," she said. 4 more cars on the way, and a brigadier general wants to know if you'll stay long enough to say a few words. Harold glanced toward the door. His hand still rested on the shadow box. And in that moment, without moving, without raising his voice, Harold Dent taught the entire room the weight of presence. "I don't speak much anymore," he said. "But maybe it's time they heard who we were. Who we still are." The room held its breath. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom or a headline. Sometimes it comes wearing boots and medals, flanking a man the world tried to forget, only to remember too late that legends don't need introductions. They just need someone brave enough to say their name out loud. It began with a door swinging open for the 6th time in 20 minutes, but this time, silence didn't just settle over the café, it landed like a gavel. The air thickened. The clatter of cutlery stopped. Even the espresso machine seemed to hush. A convoy of vehicles had filled the curb outside like a formation, and leading the final entry was a man whose uniform bore stars, not stitched in for decoration, but earned by decisions that carried the weight of lives. Major General Alan Bryce entered not like a guest, but like a conclusion. His silver hair was cropped tight, his eyes scanning the room with an alertness that made waiters freeze mid-step. And when he reached Harold Dent's table, still tucked in the corner, still quiet, he saluted not like a courtesy, but a correction. "Sergeant Major Dent," he said clearly, his voice carrying over the café's brittle quiet. "Requesting permission to speak in your presence." And for the first time all day, Harold looked surprised. But he nodded once, slow, deliberate, the kind of nod that once gave men orders to move through fire. General Bryce turned then, facing the room with an expression that belonged more to a battlefield briefing than a brunch crowd. "I've served 32 years, he said. "I've stood in Pentagon war rooms and addressed nations on broadcast. But I've never been prouder than standing here, beside the man who saved my entire recon team in '71. While wounded. With one arm." Gasps rippled. The waitress dropped her notepad. The kid who had mocked Harold earlier now stared as if the man in the wheelchair had transformed before his eyes. But he hadn't changed. Harold was exactly the same. It was the room that was finally catching up. Bryce wasn't finished. "You laughed at him," he said calmly. "Dismissed him. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but ignorance. That ends now." This man's silence was never weakness. It was discipline. Behind him, soldiers lined the café walls. Some stood at ease. Others placed coins on Harold's table, unit coins, campaign coins, some so rare they shimmered like meth. One woman knelt beside his wheelchair, placed a pair of battered dog tags beside his coffee, and whispered, "You pulled my mother from a firefight she didn't think she'd survive." Harold said nothing, but his eyes glistened. Outside, traffic backed up. Bystanders gathered. News cameras arrived, drawn not by press releases but by the sheer gravitational pull of a legacy unfolding in real time. Inside, the manager finally stepped forward, trembling slightly. "Sir," he said, unsure who to address, "we didn't know." Bryce turned. "You didn't ask." Another SUV pulled up, and from it emerged an older woman in civilian clothes, gray hair pulled back, a single envelope in her hand. "Sergeant Major Dent," she said as she approached. "I'm with the Department of Records. We've been looking for you for 20 years. There's a medal classified at the time, never awarded due to bureaucratic red tape and your own modesty. It was approved last week. I have it here." She opened the envelope and placed into Harold's hands the Congressional Medal of Honor, gleaming, heavy, long overdue. The entire café stood. Even those who had been mocking him before now stared, ashamed. Some cried. Some saluted. Some simply lowered their heads in the presence of something greater than reputation, character. "I'm not a hero," Harold said finally, voice gravel-edged and low. "Just a man who didn't leave others behind." And with that, he began to rise. Slowly, painfully, supported by the young man from earlier and Lieutenant Colonel Jameson. Harold Dent stood, first time in public in years. The crowd erupted into silent attention. No cheers. No applause. Just boots snapping to position and civilians standing with hands over hearts. Because now they knew. They knew who he was. And who they'd almost overlooked forever. The general stepped aside. The staff cleared a path. Harold walked, one step at a time, down the length of the café, flanked by comrades. And as he passed, people didn't just move, they made room. Not just at the table. In their understanding. In their memory. Outside, the street had turned into an impromptu formation. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder. Some saluted. Others held flags. The kid who had filmed the mocking video now stood holding Harold's messenger bag like it was a crown. He didn't speak, he couldn't. But he offered it forward with both hands, and Harold took it without judgment. Just a nod. A passing of memory into a new pair of hands. Later that day, Café Moselle announced it was renaming its outdoor courtyard the Dint Pavilion. No marketing, no ribbon cutting. Just a sign installed quietly at midnight with 6 engraved words. Silence isn't weakness. It's earned armor. And on Sundays, Harold returned, not for the attention, but because they finally saved a table that fit his chair. A chair that no longer meant limitation, but legacy. And from that day forward, every time someone laughed too quickly or judged too shallowly, someone else would lean in and say, "Careful. You don't know who you're sitting next to." And just like that, the world learned what respect looks like when it shows up late, but still on time.